General Grenville M. Dodge. He is best known for his contributions on the frontier by linking the two halves of America together. He was an engineer, a military man, an office holder, a wealthy businessman, but most importantly, he was a track layer. Before we get into what Dodge did, we need to take a look at who he was. On April 12, 1831, Grenville Mellon Dodge was born in Danvers, Massachusetts, to parents Sylvanus Dodge and Julia Dodge. Growing up, Dodge received a standard education for the time, and it wasn't until his teen years when Dodge helped lay tracks that he realized his affinity for the railroad. After the stint as a track layer, Dodge decided to become an engineer and at the age of 16 entered into the academy at Durham, Massachusetts, and from there to Newbury, Vermont, then finally, in 1850, ended up at Norwich University, where he graduated at the age of 20 as a civil and military engineer. After graduation from Norwich, Dodge entered the railroad business working for the Illinois Central Railroad as an axeman and surveyor. From there, he moved onto the Rock Island Railroad, where his leadership skills and remarkable judgment were realized, and in 1853, Dodge took charge of a crew surveying central Iowa to find a terminus for Rock Island Railroad on the Missouri River. While employed by the Rock Island Railroad, Dodge befriended Peter A. Day, who was at the time a division engineer of the railroad. Day took a great liking to the young Dodge, and when Day was promoted to chief engineer of the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad, he took Dodge with him to Iowa to be his principal assistant. Dodge held a profound respect for Day and viewed him as one of the most prominent engineers in the country. Dodge worked for the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad for many years and completed many surveys on vast stretches of land, and was tasked with continuing his exploration to find the best route to the Pacific west of the Missouri. A few years later, in 1859, when Dodge was returning to his home in Council Bluffs, Iowa from an exploration trip westward, President Lincoln was visiting his hometown and met with Dodge to draw from him his information about his reconnaissances. Dodge worked for the railroad until the first shots of the Civil War in 1861. At the age of 30, with about 600 other civil engineers from Norwich, he was commissioned into the Army as an officer. He was sent to Washington to secure arms and equipment for the Iowa troops, and he was offered the chance to serve in the regular army because of the skills he demonstrated as an accomplished leader and pioneering railroader. But Dodge politely declined this offer as he preferred to serve his own state, and on his return he was commissioned colonel of the 4th Iowa Infantry on June of 1861. Dodge proved to be very successful in the Union Army. He defeated his enemy in Hudson and Salem in 1861. He led the advance against Springfield on the morning of February 3, 1862, and he met and engaged his enemy at Cane Creek, Sugar Creek, and Blackburn's Mill, which commenced on the 14th, 17th, and 27th of February 1862. In one of his most important battles at Pea Ridge, the Confederates had outnumbered the Union forces severely. The rebels were led by esteemed General Earl Van Dorn, and the Union men were led by the brilliant General Curtis. Van Dorn was slyly moving his troops up to the position of the Union soldiers. Curtis knew of these movements and told his troops to fortify their positions facing south along the creek. Dodge commanded a brigade at the extreme right of Curtis's army, which the Confederate soldiers were planning to eventually flank. On the first day of the battle, March 7th, marching eastward along what was known as White River Road, Dodge heard muskets being fired and realized that he'd come upon cavalry of the enemy, who quickly dispersed through the timber and rocky hills. Dodge quickly took up Cross Timber Hollow while the enemy was moving around his right trying to cut him off. He commanded his men, "By the right flank, file left," and put his handful of troops behind an old fence with the timber on either side of him and an open field to his front where the enemy was forming for a charge. This was alarming because Dodge only had 2 regiments, the 4th Iowa and the 35th Illinois, and the enemy outnumbered him nearly 10-1 and were supported by artillery. Soon, the rebels magnificently charged across the field with their eerie scream and were expecting little opposition, but Dodge's men met them with deadly fire and they were driven back. They attempted the charge several times, but they were repulsed each time. They couldn't rout Dodge from his position until they crept up the sides of his right and left timber flanks. During the battle, General Dodge had 3 horses shot under him and was severely wounded in the side. The Battle of Pea Ridge commenced another day, and eventually, with the strong will of General Curtis, the Confederates were chased from the battleground, suffering losses of over 1,000 men. Because of his services at Pea Ridge, Dodge was awarded with the title Brigadier General on March 31, 1862. Similarly, in 1863, during the Atlantic Campaign at the Battle of Chattanooga, Dodge operated under General Sherman and commanded the 3 Iowa regiments, the 2nd, 7th, and 39th. Dodge met General Sherman at Chattanooga and held the right side of Sherman's army. Dodge marched out to Dalton, which was where rebel General Johnson's stronghold was located. Dodge helped to take over the stronghold, and for his services, he was promoted to Major General on June 7, 1864. General Ulysses S. Grant speaks on Dodge, saying there was no officer of Dodge's rank in his army to whom he was more indebted for his success in capturing the stronghold. In early August, General Dodge was severely wounded in the Atlanta campaign while visiting the skirmish parts of his trench lines. His decorated hat caught the sun's light at the right angle to produce a reflection in the eyes of a close-by Confederate sharpshooter. The sharpshooter shot his bullet at General Dodge with such accuracy that it went through the hat of General Dodge and passed round under his scalp. This injury did not prove fatal, but it took Dodge out of service for many weeks of recovery, and Dodge did not return to this post but went north instead. After the Civil War concluded in 1865, General Dodge led many campaigns against the Plains Indians, such as when he was tasked with reopening the telegraph and mail routes recently built by the Creightons at Fort Leavenworth that the Indians had partially destroyed. Despite a cold winter, Dodge restored the telegraph in March and the stage and wagon routes by the end of April. When Creighton reported to Washington headquarters on the resumption of the wire service, General Grant telegraphed, "Where's Dodge?" And Creighton replied, "Nobody knows where he is, but everyone knows where he has been." Around 1862, Dodge was called down to Washington to meet with President Lincoln after the passage of the Pacific Railway Act to discuss the matter of fixing an eastern terminus. And in December of 1864, ground was broken at Omaha for the beginning of the Transcontinental Railroad, which produced much division and turmoil. The job passed from person to person when finally, the officers of the Union Pacific requested that General Dodge return from the army and take charge of the work on the railroad. Dodge was at the moment in command of the U.S. forces out west campaigning against the Indians. General Grant was not very willing to let Dodge go, so Dodge finished his work there and then went to Omaha in May of 1866. Before accepting the duties of chief engineer, Dodge made clear his intentions in a meeting to Thomas C. Durant, who was vice president of the Union Pacific at the time. "I will become chief engineer only on condition that I be given absolute control in the field. I have been in the army long enough to know the disastrous effects of divided commands. You are about to build a railroad through a country that has neither law nor order, and whoever heads the work as chief engineer must be backed up. There must be no divided interests, no independent heads out west, and no railroad masters in New York." General Dodge accepted the duties of chief engineer of the Union Pacific Railroad in May of 1866. The choice for Dodge as chief engineer arose because of his experience as a locating engineer and his knowledge of railroad construction under difficult conditions derived from military service during the war. He also had insights into Indian characteristics gained in campaigns in 1865 and 1866, and of his past explorations in the 60s while under Peter A. Day. The location of the Union Pacific Railway under Dodge's direction was taken after the most painstaking research. It was after 25,000 miles of reconnaissance surveys and 15,000 miles of actual instrumental survey that the laying of track could commence. From 1866 until they reached Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10, 1869, Dodge was chief engineer of the Union Pacific Railroad, working with resilience, and in his service he is described to be gallant and distinguished. He has an iron will and a mind rich in experience and a judgment that is matured for a man of his age. He retired from the position of chief engineer in 1870 and retired to Council Bluffs, Iowa, where he stayed until his death in January of 1916. It is also important to mention General Dodge's wide array of experiences. In 1854, Dodge established the banking house of Baldwin and Dodge in Council Bluffs, which was later merged into the Pacific National Bank, of which he became president. This bank is still around today under the designation of Council Bluffs Savings Bank. Between 1856 to 1861, when Dodge was only 26 years old, he and a few associates organized a freighting enterprise which they conducted until 1861. They operated in the Platte Valley between the Missouri River and Denver. Funny enough, amongst his shining war record, in December of 1861, Dodge accidentally shot himself in the leg with a pistol. Also, General Dodge briefly served as a member of Congress from the 1st District of Iowa and served from 1867 to 1868, but declined renomination. After Dodge retired from the Union Railroad in 1869, he returned home a wealthy man. In 1870, Grenville was 39 years old with over $2 million in real estate value and $150,000 in personal estate value. General Dodge, with lots of financial backing from Jay Gould and Thomas A. Scott, Dodge projected and constructed numerous railroad lines, such as in the Southwest, the Texas and Pacific, parts of the Missouri, Kansas, Texas, the International and Great Northern, the Fort Worth and Denver City lines. In 1869, General Dodge decided to construct the Dodge House, which stands as a 3-story mansion with 14 rooms overlooking the Missouri Valley. Today, it stands as a museum in Council Bluffs, Iowa, opening to the public in 1965 with tours and public viewing. The Dodge House was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1965. Also, between 1874 and 1879, Dodge spent much time abroad, and he was selected by Ulysses S. Grant to confer with German and Italian engineers that were building the famous St. Gothard Tunnel under the Alps. Similarly, Dodge was consulted by the Imperial Russian government in connection with the project of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. During General Dodge's exploration days in the 1860s, he became friends with famous outdoorsman Jim Bridger, who helped him to find a suitable path to the Pacific. When Jim passed, Dodge erected a monument of his lifelong friend over his grave in 1904, which still stands today. In 1890, Dodge became president of the Denver and Gulf Railroad, which had been a part of the Union Pacific. In 1898, Dodge was appointed Major General in the war with Spain, but declined the honor. Echoing the sentiments of author George F. Ashby, Major General Grenville M. Dodge must rank high with the men who made this nation. What he did at the time he did it was to further an enterprise which would serve the nation as a binding tie between the East and the West. What he did, as a lapse of just a few years proved, was this and more. It was to civilize and people the great domain west of the Missouri River and to bring the West into a parity of importance with the East. This has been A History of Grenville M. Dodge by Ellie Dodge Gajewski. Thank you all for watching.